All right, welcome to the last talk of Objective by the Sea. They say they always save the best talk to last, so I have no idea why I got selected. All right, kind of weird introducing my own talk, but you know. All right, so welcome to my talk called Protecting the Garden of Eden. Hopefully you know my name by now. It's Patrick Wardle. I've worked at a variety of acronymed places. Currently, I am the Chief Research Officer at Digita Security, working alongside Josh and John. Briefly, at Digita, we are working to create cybersecurity tools for the Mac enterprise. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to start by talking about various malware specimens and vulnerabilities or bugs that have affected or still affect macOS today. Then after some musings, some thoughts, we are going to dive into part 2, where we're going to talk about protections, both those that are baked into Mojave, Apple's latest version of macOS, and then also some third-party tools and protection mechanisms. So let's start with a brief history of Mac malware as well as some recent Mac malware specimens. Now, first is a claim, a statement, which really should not be a surprise to this audience, and that is Macs are no more resistant to malware than their Windows counterparts. You may be wondering, okay, well, Patrick, if this statement is true, how come we are not inundated with Mac malware? And it turns out there's actually a very simple answer for that, and that is that Macs still only make up less than 10% of the PC, personal computing, market. So hackers, of course, are going to focus more predominantly on the Windows side of the house. We'll still see, though, that there is a lot of Mac malware. Okay, now a brief history of Mac malware, viruses, Trojans, etc., that have targeted the Apple's ecosystems. And first, this is one of my favorite quotes. The image is a little blurry because it's actually difficult to find, but this was on the front page of Apple's website. And what it states is that Macs, don't get PC viruses. A Mac is not susceptible to the thousands of viruses playing Windows-based computers, end quote. Now, from like a legalese point of view, this is probably technically correct, right? A Windows virus, kind of by definition, does not run on Macs. But this is an incredibly misleading, and I would argue almost manipulative statement. And actually, the first in-the-wild computer virus did not impact a Windows system. It actually infected an Apple II. And in recent years, as we can see based on the statistics on the slides, both the number of Mac vulnerabilities and malware continues to increase, and in some cases, skyrocket. Now, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so here's a nice graph from McAfee really illustrating this claim. Clearly, we can see that Mac malware, and yes, this does include adware as well, is continuing to grow, often at a rather exponential rate. So now let's look at some Mac malware specimens. We'll start with some from a few years ago that are very interesting or rather infamous, and then we'll talk about some from 2018. So it all started with Flashback, and Flashback really proved beyond any doubt that Macs, yes, could get malware. It's been said about Flashback that, quote, it's the single most significant malware infection to ever hit in the Mac community. And one of the reasons it was so prolific was that it exploited a, at the time, unpatched vulnerability that could automatically infect users' Mac's system with no user interaction at all. All a user would have to do would be visit a malicious website or perhaps a website that had been infected. And the vulnerability, which was a Java bug, would give the attacker code execution on the box. Now, the bug was known at the time, but Apple did not release a patch for 2 months, which gave hackers a really big window to infect hundreds of thousands of Macs. And we can see the total number they reached was 700,000, so almost a million Macs. And somewhat interestingly, about 250 of those actually were within Cupertino. Another intriguing piece of Mac malware is XSLCMD. Now, besides the fact it was written, or at least utilized by the Chinese, which makes it somewhat interesting, it actually utilized a zero-day exploit in its installer that at the time was unknown to any Mac security researchers. So about a year later, the zero-day vulnerability was independently discovered. The original malware analysis made no mention of this bug. It's unsure if the analysts just missed it or if they chose not to say anything about it. Basically, what the bug allowed was an unprivileged attacker to create files on the file system as root. So what the malware used to, or how the malware abused this vulnerability was to create a certain file which essentially turned on accessibility. And once accessibility was turned on, this allowed the malware to install a system-wide keylogger. So yes, even in 2014, Chinese malware was using zero-day vulnerabilities. Other nation states, such as Russia, also have developed offensive MAC capabilities. So here we're going to talk about Complex and X-Agent, which are a Russian first stage and second stage implant. Stage 1 is complex. It arrives to a target in an email. It looks like a PDF document, but in reality, it is a malicious application. If the user is tricked into running it, it's going to execute and install Complex. What Complex does is analyze the system, survey the system, and then connect to the attacker's command and control server with information about the target. Now, if the target is of interest to the Russians, they will then download and install their persistent second stage implant, which is called X-Agent. This is more feature complete and has a lot more capabilities. For example, it allows the attackers full remote access over the system, gives them the ability to enumerate process, exfiltrate files, capture the screen, and it also has a propensity or an interest in iPhone backups, which is a very unusual capability, but again, from a cyber espionage point of view, this is something that makes a lot of sense. Next up, we have Fruitfly. Fruitfly is intriguing because it was around for 13 years without being detected. So I analyzed this malware along with Thomas Reed, who spoke earlier today. And during our analysis, we found that encoded or encrypted within the malware were some backup command and control servers that were not registered at the time. And the malware would first try to contact the primary command and control servers. If those were offline, it would default to the backup. So I wrote a custom command and control server that could fully task and interact with the malware. I then registered these backup command and control servers because they were available for registration, and since the primary command and control servers were offline, all the infected victims started connecting to me. And at that point, that was a little worrisome because I could see thousands of infected hosts connecting to me, and based on the information that the malware sends when it checks in, I could see that they were predominantly within the United States. So at this point, we contact law enforcement, basically saying, hey, look, there's this significant intrusion that's going on. And luckily, they did an incredible job arresting the alleged mastermind behind this. And it turned out that he had been doing this for over a decade, allegedly, to spy on everyday users, including children. Now let's talk about some Mac malware from 2018. So the first Mac malware specimen from 2018 was called Mommy. And what it does is it installs a malicious root certificate authority, or CA, and then changes the Mac's DNS servers. So what this allows is the malware to redirect all DNS requests, which allows it to do things like redirect search results, inject ads, etc., etc. Obviously, this is a way for the attackers to financially gain. Interestingly, Mommy had some kind of connections to a piece of Windows malware. Specifically, the thumbprint for the CA was exactly the same. And also, the DNS servers were essentially the same. They were off by a few digits, but for all purposes, they were exactly the same as a Windows malware called DNS Unlocker. So what we can surmise from this is it's likely that the attackers had this financially beneficial Windows malware and decided it to rewrite and port it to macOS so that they could target more victims. Speaking of cross-platform malware, next up we have CrossRat. CrossRat was discovered by the EFF, and it was designed as a cyber espionage surveillance tool that was used by governments to spy on targets. I analyzed the macOS code, and as the analysis showed, it supported a wide range of capabilities that, again, you would expect in a cyber espionage implant. For example, the ability to run arbitrary commands interactively, capture the screen, exfiltrate files, etc., etc. Now, good news is, for most Mac users, this malware was not going to be a threat or a problem because it was written in Java, and most recent versions of macOS do not have Java installed by default. Another popular or interesting piece of malware from 2018 is WinShift. And the most interesting thing about WinShift, other than its targets, which were also interesting, the targets were individuals that would be of interest to Middle Eastern governments. So again, we can surmise maybe the attribution of this malware. But its most interesting thing from a technical point of view was its infection vector. And specifically, it abused custom URL handlers. Now, John and Josh talked about this in their presentation yesterday about how to detect such URL handlers. But let's briefly look at how the malware abused this to infect users' systems. So a user would visit a malicious site, perhaps by clicking on a link in a phishing email. And once the user got to the site, the website would automatically download a zip file. So this is something that you can do in Safari. Again, no user interaction required at this point. Safari, as Josh mentioned, would automatically unzip the archive because, again, Safari by default treats some files as safe. So now the zip file has been decompressed. Within the zip file was an application. Because the application broadcasted that it handled custom URL schemes, the operating system, macOS, would automatically register those application URL handlers. So again, no user interaction up until this point. Now code on the malicious website knows that the operating system, or assumes that the operating system, has registered these custom URL handlers, so it goes and makes a URL request to that custom scheme. Now this will generate a pop-up, but as we can see on the slide, this is very attacker controlled. For example, you can specify the name of what you want to show. So you can say, do you want to allow this web page to open apple.com? And a lot of users will fall for that. So if the users click on this, this will launch the application to handle the custom URL scheme. And of course, the application is the malware, which will now be running. Kind of neat. Other nation states that are developing offensive Mac capabilities are the North Koreans. Apple Juice was discovered by Kaspersky in 2018, and it's a North Korean malware that targets cryptocurrency exchanges. With all the sanctions that countries have placed against the North Koreans, they're a little cash-strapped. So what they've done to kind of get around this is hack a lot of banks and cryptocurrency exchanges, because this is a really kind of creative way for them to get large amounts of currencies to finance their operations. So what the North Koreans did was registered a fake trading company, and then made a fake installer for a fake trading app, and then coerced or tricked users of this exchange to install that application. As soon as the users installed this application, the North Koreans would get access to the cryptocurrency exchange, and obviously once you have access to such an exchange, you can access large amounts of cryptocurrency funds. Kind of neat. Finally, we've got OS X Creative Updater. This was distributed via the popular Mac software site, macupdate.com. What the hackers did, somehow they had access to this site, and they uploaded a Trojanized version of Firefox. So now when users went to download Firefox from this website, which a lot of users go to this website to get Mac security tools, applications, and updates, once they downloaded this version of Firefox and ran it on the system, they would have become infected. Now the malware didn't install anything particularly insidious, but it did install a crypto miner to use the user's CPU, Mac, to mine for cryptocurrency. And one interesting point is that this malware had a lot of overlaps to another malware sample from a few years ago that was also distributed via Mac Update. So again, this is likely the same attackers or some connection, again, abusing the popular Mac Update site as a way to access or infect a large number of victims. Okay, so now let's briefly talk about malware trends. So first, let's look at trends in infection vectors. Most still today, which is good from a security point of view, still require user interaction. That is, the user is going to have to be tricked into clicking through some prompts, which, as we know, a lot of users still will. But again, that's a reasonable high bar that does prevent some level of infection. However, we are seeing more of these supply chain type infections where hackers are going after third-party developer or application sites, hacking those sites, and then uploading Trojanized versions of applications, or infecting the applications that are legitimately distributed through those sites. And then any user who comes to those sites unwittingly will infect themselves if they download those software. So this is something that's very problematic, and really that most users can't avoid, or really it's not their fault at all. And in some cases, for example with Fruitfly, we have pure remote malware infections. So again, this is definitely more worrisome because users are then being infected with no interaction. Now, in terms of the goals or the objectives of Mac malware, the most common goal is to make money, which should not be that surprising. So adware is predominantly what we see. You know, if you get a call from your friend or your parents that, hey, my Mac is infected, I would say 95, 6, 7% of the time, it's going to be because of some adware. And most of this adware is not really interested in stealing people's identities. It's just showing annoying ads and generating sort of maybe redirecting search results, et cetera, et cetera. Crypto miners, we're seeing kind of an uptick in that. A few years ago, there really weren't a lot of crypto miners. But now a lot of malware, its ultimate payload or goal is to install a crypto miner on an end user's system. And although APT nation-state backdoors pop up from time to time, generally those are only going to be impacting a very small percentage of users. It's doubtful that any of us here in this room are being targeted by nation-states. If you are, I apologize, because they're probably going to get to you. But from a security point of view, these are, I would say, most interesting because they often have the most interesting infection techniques and are the most sophisticated. And even though we don't see a lot of these, we should really not assume that that's just because they're not out there. That is to say, I'm confident that every nation state that has an offensive cyber security program or an offensive hacking program is developing and likely has Mac capabilities. Okay, so now let's talk about some recent macOS bugs, some vulnerabilities, and we're really going to focus on the ones that really leave us scratching our heads and kind of wondering how these ever made it into production code and through QA. So first, another important claim, another important reality is that actually Mac computers are easier to hack than modern Windows. Now, this claim might be somewhat provocative, but it's really the truth. And we can back this up with numbers and statistics. So first, we can see that if we look at CVE counts, we can see that Mac consistently beats out Windows in a not so good way of having more reported vulnerabilities than Windows. And again, this is a lot of times what exploits and Mac use. Now, you might say, you know, these CVE metrics are a little skewed. They don't really give good insight into the security of the system. Okay, fine, let's discount that. Let's look at the value or the prices of zero-day vulnerabilities. So first, we can see that in terms of Safari bugs are cheaper than Chrome or Edge bugs. And core macOS vulnerabilities are cheaper than either Windows or Linux bugs. Now, you might be thinking, Patrick, maybe this is about supply and demand, in the sense that imagine the NSA, hypothetically, has 100 Windows targets and maybe 1 or 2 Mac targets. This might mean they need more Windows capabilities, so therefore the price is going to be higher because there's more of a demand. This is not true. You still need just one Windows exploit to access all those Windows systems, and if you have one Mac system, even if it's just one that you're interested in hacking, you're still going to need one exploit or vulnerability. So the reality is just that Macs have easier vulnerabilities and more bugs to find, and this is why the market dictates these prices. Okay, so now on to some actual vulnerabilities that I hope will back up these claims as well. So the first bug I want to talk about was a password exposure flaw in encrypted volumes. And if you think about encrypted volumes, this is where you store the most sensitive things. So the issue was the password was stored in the clear as the password hint. So very easy to replicate this bug. You create an encrypted volume, you set a password hint, obviously not the password, and then later, once you unmounted this drive and mount it to access its contents, it will prompt you for the password. If you click show hint, it would show you the actual password. Mind-blowing. So I wrote a blog about this, which I tracked down the core issue of this, and in the slide we can see exactly what's going on. Basically, as Brandon talked about, the issue was the developer cut and pasted 2 lines of code. And the second line, he or she did not change the value that was being stored in the password hint. So again, this is a dictionary, and the password key should have the password value, and the password hint should have the password hint value. But as we can see on the slide, the code actually stored the password in the clear in the password hint. So as soon as you clicked show hint, again, it would show the password for the encrypted volume. Next is another neat bug. This is a privilege escalation vulnerability I recently discovered that affected all recent versions of macOS and OS X for about the last 15 years. So first, let's look at what happens when a user wants to authenticate. For example, say an application or an installer wants to perform some privilege action or execute some privilege command. So the application or the installer will make a request to the operating system. The operating system will display an authentication prompt to the user. The user will enter their password, and assuming the password is valid, the system will validate that and generate an authentication token. This token is then passed to a setUID process called security_auth trampoline. This will then execute the command as root. Now, it's interesting, if we look at the header file, it says, do not disclose this authentication token. Because obviously, if you disclose this token, malicious code or a hacker could use this to perform the authenticated privilege action as well. And one interesting thing, though, if we look at how they pass this authentication token from the system to this SUID process, is via a temp file. Now, I was like, okay, that seems like a bad idea, but it turns out that Apple was using the TMP file API, which actually does 2 good things from a security point of view. First, it generates a randomly named file, and then more importantly, it immediately unlinks that file, meaning that no other process on the system can open that file to figure out what's inside it. So in theory, even if that authentication token is being written to that temp file, and then the file descriptor for that temp file is passed to the setUID process, malicious code cannot access that file. So this looks like it's safe, right? No, not at all. Turns out all we have to do is create a RAM disk, which is an in-memory disk image that we own. We then symlink the temp directory to point to our RAM disk. Now, anytime an authentication token is created, when the system goes to write to the temp file, because of our symlink, it will write to our RAM disk. And since it's our RAM disk, we can see whatever contents are in there. So we can basically just wait and then sniff these authentication tokens, and then we can use them and replay them to execute any command as root. So again, a very powerful logic, local privilege escalation vulnerability. And again, you're like, why are you passing this token in a temp file? Again, just really not good. Another issue I recently found allowed unprivileged malicious applications to steal the file vault unlock key. Again, this is not good. So what happens is on macOS, when you install a PKG file, Apple's installer.app would examine and read the PKG file, and if that PKG file contained any plugins, it would load those plugins into the installer.app's address space. And this is a problem, or was a problem, because the installer.app has entitlements or privileges that allow it to access this file vault unlock key. So what we could do is just create a malicious PKG file, run it. The installer.app would be like, oh, I see you got some plugins. Yes, I will load them into my trusted Apple entitled process space. Once your plugin is running in that process space, it inherits all the entitlements that the process has. So now we inherit the ability to access the file vault unlock key. So we can steal that, we can exfiltrate that, we can do whatever we want. Again, from a security point of view, what were they thinking? More bugs. Okay, so now let's talk about abusing programmatic or synthetic events. Josh and John talked about detecting these yesterday. I will talk now about the core issues. So Apple understandably protects UI components from programmatic events. For example, the keychain. They know that malware may attempt to interact programmatically and try to click on the allow access button that is displayed. So they try to block and filter events that are programmatically generated. Turns out that macOS has this feature called mouse keys. And what mouse keys does is it turns the keyboard into the mouse. So what code could do was basically turn on mouse keys, then send a synthetic key press. With mouse keys on, the system would translate the key press to a mouse event. And now, since the mouse event is coming from the system, these UI prompts would allow that. So we could do things like dump the keychain, approve kernel extensions, really interact with any UI component, programmatically, synthetically. Again, not with some crazy vulnerability or exploit, just using some feature that's built into the operating system. So I reported this bug to Apple, and they fixed it. But turns out there's still another flaw that affects macOS, at least pre-Mojave. So normally, when you generate a synthetic click, you have to simulate what the user does. And so we think about a mouse click. It has two parts, right? It has mouse click down and then mouse click up. So what you normally do is you send a mouse click down and then a synthetic mouse click up event. However, turns out if you send two mouse click down events in a row, the system basically says, this second mouse down doesn't really make sense. This should probably be a mouse up event. So it kindly translates that second mouse down to a mouse up event and then delivers it to the UI component. Again, since this is now coming from the system, the UI component will trust the click. And I kind of knocked on Apple earlier about copying and pasting code accidentally. The way I actually found this bug was I copied and pasted the mouse click down twice, and I didn't actually update it. And so when I ran this and I worked, I was like, oh my god, I just found a bug by copy and pasting. It's kind of embarrassing, but I think it's actually more embarrassing for Apple. Okay, another bug we have is the IAmRouteRunner vulnerability. This was actually really, really bad. So it turns out if you wanted to get root access on a Mac, all you had to do was click authenticate twice, as the animated GIF on the slide shows. This was actually posted to Apple's developer forums as a helpful hint. So if you guys want 0 days, maybe just read the developer forums. So I reverse engineered the macOS authentication mechanisms to figure out the cause or the root of this bug. And it turns out the system calls the OD verify crypt password to verify the user-specified password. This function takes a Boolean parameter, and this is very important, that is set to true or false if the password matches what the user has previously set. The problem was, as we can see in code, is that this Boolean parameter was never checked. Instead, the code was merely checking that the function succeed. So this function would also return an error message if there was some system error. But again, there could be a case where the password was incorrect, the function would return OK, and since Apple was not checking this parameter, it was always allowed to succeed. Very recently, we've had probably, which is one of the worst Mac and iOS bugs I am aware of, and it is because it is a pure remote triggerable bug that affects code within the kernel. So we can see the video. The finder of this bug basically is sending an ICMP packet, which crashes at the time of fully updated Mac, iPhone, and iPad. The issue is, or was, that when the system receives an invalid ICMP packet, it tries to respond with an error. When it's responding with this error, though, it takes the corrupted, invalid ICMP packet and copies it into a buffer that is too small. So you have a heap overflow in the context of the kernel that is remotely triggerable. It really doesn't get worse than this. Okay, so now let's talk about Apple's patching issues. Because, to be fair to Apple, everyone who writes software is going to have bugs in their code. I write software, my software has bugs. So it's understandable that your bugs have code. Maybe not as bad as the ones we just talked about, but still, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Now, if you're going to screw up a patch, though, that's really inexcusable. And unfortunately, Apple seems to have a history of bungling these patches. Now, yes, this is embarrassing to Apple, but this also introduces a security risk, because hackers can simply reverse engineer patches and see if Apple has correctly fixed the flaw. And a lot of times, these flaws weren't previously known. So when you reverse engineer the patch, you say, oh, wow, that was a really neat vulnerability that Apple found or was privately reported. And if the patch does not correctly fix that issue, you've now just given away a really powerful 0-day capability, which hackers can and do then target Mac users. A little secret, I actually have a ton of CVEs. This is how I collect my CVEs from Apple. I just reverse engineer their patches. They continually mess up how they fix those. So then we report a vulnerability to Apple basically saying, hey, your patch is incomplete, or I found another code patch path which allows me to exploit this vulnerability in another manner, they will have to fix that as a CVE. So again, good to collect CVEs, but again, from a security professional, this really bothers me because it's really putting Mac users at risk. Another security issue lies in the fact that Apple does not validate apps in the Mac App Store, even though they claim that this is the safest way to get software. So recently, we had a scenario where a top grossing application, it was number 4 in the Mac App Store, number 1 for utilities, meaning it was featured on apple.com, had a very dirty secret. When you ran this application, which again was from the official Mac App Store, meaning it had been validated and secured by Apple, it would take your browsing history and exfiltrate it to a Chinese developer. Now, I don't know about you, and no offense to the Chinese, but I don't want them having access to my browsing history. And the worst part about this, at least again to me as a security professional, we reported this vulnerability to Apple and they did nothing. Until we went to the media about a month later and Apple started getting all this bad press. So within that month, Apple didn't pull the app, they didn't respond to our critiques, but they did keep getting a 30% cut from every sale. So now I want to kind of switch gears and talk about some thoughts, some musings, because, you know, at this point, I hope you are thinking, like, what's going on? Why are all there these bugs, these issues, there's malware, you know, and Apple's still claiming that these Macs are essentially unhackable. So first, let's see what the world's top Mac security researchers have to say. And I'm not going to read these because there's some swear words, and some of them are pretty controversial. But they're very interesting. At least they're very interesting to me. And even if we assume that these security researchers are completely incorrect in these claims, which they are not, Apple still has an issue if all the world's top third-party Mac security researchers have these views of Apple. So clearly something is going on. Now, to me at least, one of life's secrets to understanding a situation is really to understand or uncover the motivations behind why a company, why a person, why a software, why are they doing what they do. And for Apple, this is a little tough to do at first, because they tell us things like, we deeply care about our users, and privacy and security is paramount. And I actually believe that they believe this as well. But if we take a closer look at their actions, they oftentimes don't back up these claims, which is confusing. But actually, in reality, it's really not. You have to understand that Apple is a publicly traded company, and in the US, by law, companies have to do what's best for their shareholders, not their users. This is not some conspiracy, this is fact. And again, there's recent case law that backs this up. So when privacy and security means there's more sales, Apple will gladly follow that route. But when China says, hey, no more VPN applications in the Mac store or all Mac sales are coming to an end, who do you think Apple chooses? Users or their shareholders? Their shareholders. Again, this is by law. They have to do this. If they do not do this, their shareholders will sue them and likely will win. Now again, I don't really have a problem with companies trying to make the most money for their shareholders, but when they're telling us that this is not the case, but their actions speak otherwise, personally, I think that's misleading. So now let's kind of look at what another company does, because although I don't have any Microsoft products, I love my Apple products to death. It's really interesting to see how they approach security. And interestingly, if you care about security more than anything else, you should probably be using a Windows device. And maybe this is why Jonathan had a Windows device when he was giving his presentation. So Microsoft has embraced the fact that any software is going to have vulnerabilities. This is actually a very emotionally mature stance to take. So once they've accepted this fact, they take a lot of actions that have really positive things for their end users. For example, they host their own security conference where they invite hackers who have hacked their products to give talks, and then they listen and learn. They also have very detailed reports articulating and detailing the exploits against their system, how those exploits are working, and what malware is attacking the systems. They also have comprehensive bug bounty programs and a really solid relationship with external researchers in the outside community. And the end result of this is that the security of these systems in modern Windows systems is actually incredible. The type of bugs that are reported are often very, very sophisticated. The low-hanging fruits we see on macOS are rarely similar on Windows. And often now we also see exploit prices for Windows continuing to increase. Now, in my opinion, Apple has some room to improve. First, they are the complete opposite of transparent. So a great example of this is MRT. MRT is Apple's malware removal tool. And this is built into every version of macOS. This is not something that Apple even talks about, because talking about it would be admitting that Macs get malware, which from a sales point of view is not something they want to readily admit. You know, security researchers, though, we know that there's this product. And the issue is, at least with transparency, is anytime a new piece of Mac malware comes out that Apple uncovers, and they cover a lot because they have a lot of insight into Macs all over the world, they release a new signature for that and name the malware. The problem is they don't talk to the outside security community or the antivirus community, as far as I know, and I have a lot of friends in the antivirus community who confirm this. So as security professionals and AV companies who are trying to protect Mac users, we are completely left in the dark. We go to Apple and say, hey, look, we know you found some new Mac malware because there's these new strings and signatures in this product and file you don't really talk about. Please tell us more. And they don't. So it's really frustrating. They also never talk to the media. Their patches, as we saw, often have issues, which, in my opinion, puts Mac users at risk. They don't have a Mac OS bug bounty program. And even in the recent versions of their operating system, we keep finding these bugs that are just like mind-numbingly simple. In my opinion, I think it's just because they spend more money on marketing than on security. And the end result is that Mac computers are far easier to hack than recent versions of Windows. There is a huge silver lining, which is I have great job security. And you know, why is this all a problem? Who cares if Apple is telling people that Macs are more secure when this is not the case? And I love this quote because it really succinctly articulates the problem and basically shows that many people, and you talk to non-security professionals, even users in your organizations, will fervently believe that their Macs are incredibly secure. And this is really detrimental because it gives a sense of complacency, which makes them actually more vulnerable to threats and trends. And a perfect example of this is Fruitfly. So as I mentioned, for over 12 years, Fruitfly was infecting Mac computers around the US and spying on victims, mostly children, through the webcam. Again, largely because Mac users were naive. And I think Apple has some responsibility in this as well. And so here's kind of an interesting story, which to me really illustrated with striking clarity Apple's kind of approach to security. So I gave a talk at DEF CON about Fruitfly from a technical point of view. And at that time, there was an ongoing investigation with the FBI that Apple and myself were involved with. So it's paramount for me not to compromise that investigation and also not to reveal any information about the victims for privacy concerns, largely because most of them were children. So after my talk, I kind of got some negative communications from an individual at Apple, basically saying, you know, giving me grief about my talk. And my first reaction was to assume that this was because I had said something that would compromise the investigation or perhaps undermine the privacy of the victims. However, this did not turn out to be the case. As we can see on the capture of the text messages, they basically said, we don't give a shit about the investigation. We only care about the bad press because we do not think that this is a case that has any interest. And that to me really bothered me. I was like, here you have an individual that for over a decade was spying on children, and you don't think this is something that we should be talking about? Obviously, there's other people out there that are equally creepy that are doing these horrible, insidious things, and we need to have a mature discussion about this so that parents and children can be aware of these risks and then adequately mitigate this. So this was really, really impacted me from a negative point of view that, again, this individual, who may not speak for Apple proper, really said, no, the only reason we care about this is because we are getting bad press. Okay, so now let's get back to some technical stuff. Let's talk about some protections, starting with Mojaves, because clearly we need some built-in protections to make sure that our Macs are not hacked all day. So in Mojave, Apple has actually done a lot of things, and they're really moving the bar in the right direction. So first and foremost, they have really kind of tried to step up improving privacy protections. And we've shown there's still some issues, but again, they're moving in the right direction. So now, for example, applications or binaries who want to access the camera or mic will generate an alert. This is actually a really good idea because there is a ton of Mac malware that attempts to spy on its users via the webcam or the microphone. So if we look at how this is implemented, we can see that when a binary or an application wants to gain access to the mic or the webcam, the operating system will block this request and then check if the application is either entitled or has an entry in the privacy database that allows it. Obviously, if it's a new application or a new binary, it's not going to have entitlements because these entitlements are Apple specific. And also, it's not going to be in the privacy database because it has never been run before. So this is really good. There's going to be a block, a pop-up, and again, the system will block it until the user clicks allow. In Mojave, Apple has also introduced code to block synthetic events, which again is a really good idea. Now, this does have some impacts to usability, but from a security point of view, this is a plus. So as we can see on the slide, if we now execute code to generate a synthetic mouse click, while this would have worked without being blocked on previous versions of macOS, on Mojave, this will generate an alert and will be blocked until the user basically confirms the application. Similarly, if we try to generate a synthetic key press, this will similarly be blocked. In Mojave, Apple has also introduced the notion of Apple event sandboxing. Security researcher named Felix really dove into this and describes how it all works, so I would check out his blog if this is of interest into you. Basically, though, as Felix notes, applications now also have to have approval before they can send Apple events to other processes. And this is a good idea, again, from a security point of view, because in the past, applications could basically send events to other processes, telling them to perform actions on their behalf. Again, though, these things always do impact usability. So I read a tool called BlockBlock, and we'll talk about this briefly more, that monitors for persistence. And when it detects a malicious persistence attempt, it will block and delete that persistent item. And for login items, it does this by sending an Apple event. On Mojave, because of Apple's new security protections, this security tool is now broken. So this is understandably, from Apple's point of view, kind of difficult because sometimes their security improvements break security tools. And again, the problem is if these security protections are not implemented in a secure manner, which often they are not, security tools are going to be broken, but hackers are still going to have a way to bypass all of this. Finally, we've got app notification. This is a new thing in Mojave, which is another great security improvement. So one issue that macOS faces is that most Mac malware is signed. And a lot of Apple's defenses basically allow signed code. For example, Gatekeeper. If you have an application that is signed with a developer ID, in its default settings, Gatekeeper will not block that from running. So this is why, obviously, malware authors steal or fraudulently obtain signing certificates. However, with app notification, which is opt-in for now, but in the future will be required, what Apple does is both scan or examine the signing cert and the application. So in theory, they can basically say, okay, yes, this is validly signed, but this is actually malware and block it. So again, it gives more insight into what the malware may be doing and shuts down a big attack vector that's currently used. Mojave also supports the concept of a hardened runtime, which means that third-party application developers can compile their apps to thwart a variety of runtime attacks. So for example, with the hardened runtime, applications can now be protected from things like code injection attacks. Again, this is a really good idea. If you're implementing a security tool, it's likely that if it's popular enough, malware will eventually look for that tool and at runtime try to inject code into it or perhaps shut it down before it performs some malicious actions. But if you're using app notarization and have opted into the hardened runtime, which Apple offers on Mojave, you basically get a nice level of self-defense and protection for your tool. Now, since, as we mentioned, Apple has to balance usability and security, sometimes, generally, they err on the side of usability, which means that sometimes things aren't as secure as we would like. So third-party tools and protections, in my opinion, still play a very important role. So it's wise to assume, as Richie alluded to yesterday, that if you own a Mac computer or if you manage Mac computers, at some point, some of them will get hacked. Unfortunately, traditional antivirus products may not detect this, Fruitfly being, again, the perfect example. 13 years wasn't detected at all. So in my opinion, the best bet is to detect infections by looking for malicious actions. And the analogy I like to give is when you get the flu or when you get a cold. So every year, winter comes around, even in Hawaii, and people get the flu. And every year, the flu is new, which means every year you have to go get a flu shot. Now, you can kind of know that you're sick without even knowing it's the flu, right? If you have a runny nose, cold, stuffy throat, etc., you know that something is wrong. So we can take this analogy and we can apply this to generically detecting malware. We can look for the actions that malware do, for example, persisting, spying, encrypting, ransoming files, or exfiltrating data, and say, okay, we don't really even care what the malware is specifically, but we basically just care that some malicious actions are occurring. So let's talk about how we can kind of do this. So first, let's talk about persistence. As many of the presentations we heard at this conference alluded to or discussed, essentially all malware is going to persist. And in the context of these talks in this presentation, persistence means a way that malware can install itself so that it will be automatically re-executed anytime the operating system starts. Since there's a finite number of ways that malware can persist, let's just monitor those as a way to generically detect malware when it installs. So the first tool I wrote is Knock Knock. It's kind of like auto runs for Windows. And what it does is it just persistently enumerates all the persistence location and tells you what's there. So legitimate software can persist too. For example, Google Chrome's updater, an antivirus product, etc. But if there's persistent malware on your system, it will show up here as well. So again, when I get a call from a friend saying their computer is infected, this is generally the first tool I run because it'll show me a list of about 10 files that are persisted on the system. And then very quickly I can say, okay, this is Chrome, it's signed by Chrome, this is Spotify, but what is this unsigned process called, Adobe Flash Updater? And then I can go and look at that, and more than likely that's the malware. Now, Knock Knock was good, but the problem is it's reactive. It really doesn't provide any real-time protection. So I wanted something that was a little more comprehensive. So the next tool I wrote was called Block Block, and Block Block monitors the locations that Knock Knock enumerates, and anytime software persists itself, Block Block will alert the user. So it doesn't try to say if something is malicious or not. By design, it just said, hey, something persisted. And if you're running an installer from a trusted source, you can click Allow. But if you opened a Word document and all of a sudden Block Block says, hey, just to let you know that Word document persisted a cron job, this is probably a likely indication that that Word document had a vulnerability or a weaponized exploit. And the power of Knock Knock is since its release, it has been able to detect every piece of Mac malware that has come out after it when that malware goes to persist. Another tool I wrote is called Oversight, and it generically detects when any application or code accesses the webcam. So yes, it's designed to detect things like Fruitfly when it tries to spy on people. But it can also, and does, detect when legitimate applications do surreptitious things. So I had a user contact me saying, hey, I use Shazam on my Mac, and I think your application might have a bug because when I turn Shazam off, your application does not tell me that the mic is turned off as well. Well, I reverse engineered Shazam, and it turned out that Shazam was still listening to you even when you turned it off. So again, by using these generic detections, we have a very powerful way to detect both malware and legitimate applications that are doing shady things. Ransomware is another thing that we can generically detect, because if you think about it, ransomware is going to rapidly encrypt your files. This is not something that normally happens on an everyday basis, especially from an untrusted process that's likely from the internet. So it's very easy to write a generic algorithm that can monitor the file system for the rapid creation of encrypted files by untrusted processes. So we have ransomware, which is the name of the tool, and again, since its release, all the public Mac ransomware that has come out, it has been able to generically detect. Had no a priori knowledge of that ransomware, but again, because it uses this heuristic detection, it can generically detect them. Finally, we have Lulu. Lulu is a free open source firewall for macOS. I'm sure you're very familiar with Little Snitch and other commercial products. Those are great products, but they cost a lot of money and their source code is not available. I thought it'd be great to have a free open source alternative. And in terms of malware, this is a very powerful tool because essentially all malware is going to either exfiltrate data or connect to a command and control server for tasking. So what Lulu can do is it can intercept those requests and alert the user, basically saying, hey, just to let you know, this flash updater is connecting to an IP address in Russia. Some users will still click allow, but hopefully some will be alerted to the fact that they are infected. Now, the biggest, maybe only, drawback of these tools is there's a lot of them, and the average user is probably not going to know what to do, right? They get a pop-up from block saying something was just persisted. They're going to be like, what is persistence? They're just going to click allow, right? So recently, I helped co-found a company called Digita, and one of the things we're doing is really trying to alleviate some of those shortcomings. And Josh and John gave a great discussion about some of those products and the techniques, so I'm not really going to go into them. But basically, just to point out again, it kind of takes all the amazing detection heuristics from these free Objective-C tools, builds them into a kind of way more powerful monitoring capability that then, as Josh talked, is fed into Apple's GameKit engine, and then can very powerfully and generically detect a wide range of malicious actions, and then, for example, alert you, generate some logs. So again, a lot more useful, I would argue, in an enterprise environment. All right, so let's wrap this all up and get to the raffle. So the first part of this talk, we showed that Mac malware is unfortunately on the rise. This is a reality. Users are still going to click on stuff. Hackers are very financially motivated, so unfortunately, Mac malware is not going away anytime soon. We also showed that unfortunately, macOS is riddled with rather ridiculous security vulnerabilities. Second part of the talk, we showed that Mojave is an incredible step in the right direction. Apple has really implemented some progressive security and privacy improvements, so I do like to pick on Apple a lot, but I also want to acknowledge and give them kudos for this. However, I think the reality is these Mojave systems are still going to get infected. We would be really naive to think that this was not the case, right? We showed some vulnerabilities that still exist in Mojave, and it's likely that there's going to be more. I think until something really changes at Apple, their patches are still going to be questionable, the software they released is still going to have bugs, so hackers are going to find a way in. And again, Mac users are unfortunately very, very naive, largely because of the propaganda that Apple continues to push. So this, unfortunately, means they are going to click on email attachments. They are going to click on phishing links, right? They are not as educated as their Windows counterparts. So again, I really think that third-party security tools still play an important role. All right, so mahalo for attending my talk. I also want to thank all the patrons, the friends of Objective-C, first and foremost Digita. And really, this wraps up the conference. So we are going to take a few questions for the talk, and then we are going to transition to the raffle. Now, I know you all want to get to the raffle, but let's at least have one or two questions before we get there. No questions? Come on. You can ask me what Apple thinks about me. No, I'm just, don't. We'll get there in a second. Yes, in the front. That's a great question. The question was basically Apple using MDM, especially in enterprise. What can kind of the user do, the average consumer? I'm going to caveat, I know nothing about MDM. This is why I work with other professionals who understand these things. What I think the third-party user can still do, luckily Apple has not limited too much yet what security tools can do. So they are looking to do things like not allow kernel extensions, but the hope is that they provide other interfaces that third-party security tools can still utilize to provide extra protection above and beyond what is baked into the operating system. So I'm hopeful that Apple doesn't go the route of iOS where they lock everything down, and yes, you have a really secure device, but if someone hacked your iPhone, how would you know? You wouldn't, because it's essentially this black box. So for the average user, the iPhone is incredible. But again, nation states do, we all know, have completely remote capabilities that allow them to infect arbitrary targets, even on the latest version of iOS. And again, the problem is because Apple has locked down these devices so much, you can't run a process list. You can't see what's connecting out. So once these nation states have access to one of these iPhones, they are stoked because you are never finding out that there's an infection on there. So I really hope they don't go on that same route with macOS because it would really limit, unfortunately, what people can do. I love Brandon's demo with the SIP because he basically showed as soon as you have one vulnerability, now you can install something that even an antivirus, an admin, anybody cannot delete that file. So again, these security mitigations that Apple introduces, a lot of times sophisticated attackers can and do use that to their benefit. Yes, Mike.
Yeah, so the part where Digita is doing the game plan?
Yes.
Yeah, so I saw the diagram there where it showed the monitor kit incorporated all these components of free tools, Objective-C's put out so far and all that kind of stuff. Going forward, additional tools, are we still going to see stuff come over Objective-C? I'm guessing game plan's probably going to be monetized.
Yes, that's an excellent question. So the question is, Digita is amazing, but Objective-C is too. So, you know, is it essentially going to neuter Objective-C's tools? And the great thing is, when I started Digita with Josh and Don, I sat down and said, first and foremost, I want to not deviate from what Objective-C is doing. And the cool thing is they're incredibly supportive. So not only are new tools coming out, but they're all going to be open source. Monitor Kit is open source as well, which is great. So really the approach we're taking is that Objective-C tools don't really work that well in the enterprise anyways, by design. So this is kind of like an enterprise version that has like cloud-based stuff, enterprise deployment, centralized logging, and a bunch of other stuff. But the Objective-C tools will always be free, always be open source, and again, for the average user, would be free. And again, you can still use the Objective-C tools in the enterprise, but I would recommend using the Digita stuff because it's been designed from the ground up for that. So very great question. That's one of the reasons I'm not working at Apple because, again, I don't want to give up creating these free tools that I passionately believe help Mac users stay secure. Yes, in the back.
Do you have plans for new tools that you would like to kind of spoil or?
Ha! That's a great question. Sure, why not? So one thing I've been thinking about writing is kind of a generic crypto miner detector because we're seeing, what I kind of like to do is look at where malware trends are going. We saw a big tick in ransomware a year and a half ago, and I was like, this is something we should generically be able to detect. So crypto miner is kind of a big one. Key logging detection is kind of cool. We've actually been working on that in Digita. So I'd say those are kind of maybe on the forefront of my mind. And then just continually to improve the other tools. This is kind of a catch-22 because I've released about 10 plus tools and people always have great feature requests. And so it's like, do I maintain and fix those or run off and write some new tool? So, you know, the struggle is real. But keep those feature requests coming. Awesome. All right, we are now going to switch gears to talking about winning stuff. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's clapping for the prizes, right? Okay, so I'm going to put on my presenter hat, be very professional here, not rag on Apple anymore. Apologies, Apple. So, first and foremost, thank you all for attending Objective by the Sea, version 1.0. Super stoked you all showed up, and I don't know about you guys and girls, but I had a really incredible time. Again, I really would like to extend thanks to our sponsors. First and foremost, Digita Security has really partnered with us to bring this conference to a reality. Incredibly supportive of my open source efforts with Objective-C, which I'm incredibly thankful for. Also, the other sponsors, again, Sophos, Malwarebytes, SmugMug and Flickr, the Secure Mac, and the Guardian Mobile Firework. Again, this conference was free to attend for people in Hawaii, which I thought was really important to kind of encourage. Woo! There's more than one. And then for any Patreon providers. So again, without these sponsors, this conference really would not be a reality. So again, really thankful to them. They're doing all sorts of incredible research. So if you're interested in Mac stuff, check them out as well. Also, on a more personal note, I really would like to thank all the Patreons. The majority of you here support me via Patreon each month, which, again, is just a humbling, mind-blowing experience. It really allows me to develop these free open source tools that have no ads, that aren't trying to monetize users, that aren't, feature incomplete. And it's funny because one of my favorite antivirus company has this quote, and it says, if the product is free, you are the product. And I think the tools that Objective-C creates really go against this, where there really is no ulterior motive except to make these free open source tools. But again, this is only possible because of the support of my Patreon. So again, I am incredibly indebted to you, and more importantly, Mac users around the world are benefiting from your support. I also would like to reach out and thank Andy, our conference organizer. So two things. First, and you probably all don't know this, the idea for this conference was actually Andy's idea. So about 6 months ago, she said, Patrick, you're a little stubborn and sometimes a little slow. Why don't you have a Mac security conference in Maui? And in retrospect, that was like a genius idea, right? So I'm forever indebted to her for that. And then more importantly, I was like, yeah, okay, this is a phenomenal idea. People are going to want to come to Maui. We can nerd out about Mac security stuff. We can all hang out. We can have a party. I have no idea how to organize a conference, right? I hack on things and, annoy Apple. So she really ran with that and really helped organize the conference, took care of all the details. So again, let's just give her another round of applause. Now, I love to travel, and whenever I travel, I always try to plan my next trip before I get home, because I'm not that bummed coming back to Maui, but I'm a little bummed because I'm like, oh man, that trip was awesome. So I'm sure a lot of us are kind of a little sad. Well, I'm hoping that you're a little sad that this conference is over. So I want to end on some positive news. So the first thing is look for a training that's going to be offered Digita and Objective-C early next year. We're going to talk and offer some trainings on Mac malware analysis, talking about using the Objective-C tools and some of the tools like MonitorKit, how you can use those in your environment, and also some general Mac security things. So follow Digita on Twitter. I'm super stoked about this training. I don't know if it'll be in Hawaii, but I'm trying to get it here again. But if not, maybe California. And even better news, we are going to announce Objective-C 2.0. We are going to be doing this in Europe, largely because I had a lot of friends that couldn't make it to this conference because, Europe is really far away. One of those being Ian Beer, who promised me he would give a talk if I did a conference in Europe. So we're looking for early spring, late summer, and because of the name, Objective by the Sea, it's going to be somewhere incredible, maybe Portugal, Spain, somewhere on the sea. So no, for a lot of you coming from the US, that's a very far flight, but it's still reasonably close, so I hope to see all of you there. And yes, we will also be doing another one, God willing, in Maui next year around this same time. So I hope to make this an annual thing, and I hope to see all of you, with all your friends and coworkers and families, attending this as well. All right, before we get to the raffle, just again, one last mahalo. Make sure to tweet about the amazing time you had here so we get more sponsors and more people come next year. Also, we will be posting the slides from all the speakers online, likely on the conference website. And also, we will be reposting the recordings. So, let us now get to the raffle, which I'm hoping isn't the only reason you're all still here. Awesome. Andy, will you assist me? Okay, so we have some awesome gifts. Prizes, I should say. So first we have the incredible books by Mr. Jonathan Levin. His company, Technologeek, does all sorts of incredible trainings. So if you're interested in Mac security, I would highly recommend his trainings and his books. He also has told me he will autograph them. So whoever wins those, go bug. It's optional. I don't know if that means for you or for him. So you don't have to get him autographed. Who wouldn't want Jonathan's autograph? Okay, so, yes. You can pick it, Andy, come on. All right, so the number is 6975717. Going once. 6975717. Does this mean I win them? All right. This is good. This means all your chances of winning increase. Yeah, or decreased, increased. Okay, 6975783. Yes, in the back. Woo! Oh, hold on, guys. Again, thanks to Jonathan. He actually donated these books. He was offended when I offered to pay for them, which I think is, oh, yeah, good. I'm very appreciative. Could totally have just gotten socially engineered. Incredible books. You know, I have about 5 books on my bookshelf, and 2 of them are Jonathan's. And when version 2 comes out, that will be 6 books on my desktop. So again, incredible books. Next, we have the Apple AirPods. And Malwarebytes, the sponsors responsible for these, so thank you to them. We have 6975723. Yes. Awesome. And feel free to you know, tweet about winning these awesome gifts. Shameless, I know, but you know, like to have lots of people next year. All right, now we have the 4th generation Apple Watch. Our sponsors, Sophos, thanks to them. This is, you know, the most recent version that just came out. Space gray, aluminum case. Man, I want this. I don't actually have an Apple Watch. Six nine seven five 717. Wow, all right. Promise this isn't rigged. Okay. Wow, that person would have done really well. Whoever that is, sucks to be them. 6975756. 6975756. Wow. Sucks to be that person. 6975763. Oh, in the back. Woo! Congrats. I see your ticket? I promise this is not implanted. Okay, well, like, yeah. Awesome. All right, finally, we have the Nintendo Switch. And this is thanks to Digita, our conference partner. I don't have a Switch either, man. I know, although then I would do even less work. We have 6975823. Huh. That's me. All right. Feel good about this one. 6975774. Oh, yeah. Woo. Yeah. Perfect. So. Awesome. All right, well, this wraps up the version 1.0 of Objective by the Sea. Again, round of applause for sponsors, conference, attendees, and me.